Janab Sheikhul Jamia. May I have your permission to declare the convocation open? With the permission of the Sheikhul Jamia, I declare the special convocation open. I now request Janab Qari Muhammad Sulaiman Qasmi to come to the dais and recite from Holy Quran. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق اقرأ وربك الأكرم الذي علم بالقلم علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم كلا إن الإنسان ليطغى أن رآه استغنى إن إلى ربك الرجعى أرأيت الذي ينهى عبدا إذا صلى أرأيت إن كان على الهدى أرأيت إن كان على الهدى أو أمر بالتقوى صدق الله العظيم. Students of Jamia Millia Islamia shall now present the Jamia Taram. I request the Sheikh Jamia to welcome Professor Edward Said.
Professor Edward Said, honorable members of the Jamia Millia Islamia's court, the Executive Council, the Academic Council, distinguished guests, members of faculty, and students of Jamia Millia Islamia. I have immense pleasure in welcoming Professor and Mrs. Edward Said to Jamia Millia Islamia this morning. Professor Said is a well-known figure in the world. He is renowned for his thinking. He is a visionary. He is a great scholar and a prolific writer. His writings have been translated in 26 languages across the world. He has been a member of the Palestine National Council since 1997 to 1991. He has championed the cause of the Palestinian people. We at Jamia Millia Islamia are very happy that he has come to us during the golden jubilee year of our independence, which happens to be the birth centenary year of Dr. Zakir Hussain, the one who steered the course of Jamia during its crucial phase in history. As you are all aware, Jamia has had a glorious past. Its present is full of hope. By the grace of Lord Almighty, its future is very bright. God willing, we will enter the 21st century with hope, determination, and confidence, so that the goal we have set ourselves, that is achieving academic excellence, we achieve it. Also, I take this opportunity of welcoming their excellencies and distinguished guests who are with us this morning on this special convocation ceremony to confer on Professor Edward Said the degree of Doctor of Letters honoris causa. Thank you.
I request Professor Zahid Hussain Zadi, Senior Professor of Jamia Millia Islamia, to read out the citation.
Mr. Vice Chancellor, in an age of specialization and professionalism, which creates blinkers on the rest of the world, Professor Edward Said stands out as a scholar, critic, philosopher, and political thinker, rejecting disciplinary barriers in his quest towards discovering patterns in interrelationship of history, society, and literature. He is perhaps the only writer from the East who has set his own agenda to discern and analyze the Western intellectual tradition by acting as a moral agent rather than joining the ranks of writers who perpetuate received ideas. Ever since the publication of his monumental work, Orientalism, in 1978, Professor Said has continued to generate debate in universities and academia on the interpretation of texts, approaches to historiography, relationship of culture to society and the cause of Palestinians. Born in Jerusalem, Edward Said received his BA from Princeton and PhD from Harvard. At present, he is university professor and chairs the doctoral program in comparative literature at Columbia University. Professor Said has been lecturing for the last 20 years throughout the US, Europe, and Midwest. Foremost among his lecture series include the William Anderson Lectures at Cambridge, Amnesty Lectures at Oxford, Rene Wellek Lectures at the University of California, and the first Raymond William Lecture in London. In 1998, Professor Said will be the first Vice President of the Modern Languages Association and its President in 1999. His writings have appeared in 26 languages in several countries. Professor Said's first book was on Joseph Conrad, wherein he explores the relationship between the author's life and his fiction. Professor Said's magnum opus, Orientalism, argues the way in which the Europeans since the 18th century have raised their empire by appropriating the idea of the Orient and thus the Orient itself by projecting it as mysterious, duplicitous, dark other. Blaming the victims is spurious scholarship and the Palestine question. The politics of dispossession, the struggle for political self-determination, examine the issues and concerns closest to his heart. Covering Islam, an important work in its own right, appeared in 1981. In this book, he examines some of the stereotypes of the West about Islam, culture and imperialism. In the words of Noam Chomsky, helps us understand who are we and what we must do if we aspire to be moral agents, not servants of power. His other works include Beginnings, The World, The Text, and The Critic, and Literature and Society. In the present world, fragmented by conflicts, racial, political, denominational, Professor Said conveys his vision when he says that the success of human destiny and future world lies in the evolution over time and notions of community, and not on dreams that shut out the person and half of reality. In honoring Professor Said with the degree of Doctor of Letters, honoris causa, the Jamia Millia Islamia, an institution established to encourage innovative thought and champion the cause of India's freedom, acknowledges his contribution to modern scholarship and critical thought. I therefore pray, Mr. Vice Chancellor, that you may most graciously confer on Professor Edward Said the degree of Doctor of Letters. I, by the authority vested in me as Sheikhul Jamia, Jamia Millia Islamia, confer upon Professor Edward Said the degree of Doctor of Letters honoris causa.
Mr. Sheikh al-Jam'a, members of the faculty, distinguished guests, trustees of the university, students, friends. I'm almost speechless, but not quite. I think one always has to have something to say. This is an extremely moving moment for me, and I feel terribly flattered and honored by your recognition and your kindness and generosity. India, this is my first trip to India, and I should tell you that as a child of Jerusalem, Al-Quds Al-Sharif, I grew up as a child in what were at the time British colonies, Palestine and then in Egypt after 1948. And India, strange though it will seem to you, was a country that I knew more about, understood to the best of my abilities to understand anything, and had affection for more than any other country, even my own country, because I went to English schools, colonial schools, and India, at the time that I was growing up, was, of course, the pride of the British Empire. So I grew up reading Kipling, but I also grew up reading and hearing about the great liberation movement that brought independence to India in 1947. And figures like Gandhi and Nehru were extremely important parts of my youth. So I feel, in a certain sense, if you will allow me the sentiment, that I'm returning to India rather than coming here for the first time. I'm also deeply grateful that the first occasion that I have to speak in India is at a university whose name is an Arabic name, which is my native language, Jamia, Millia, Islamia. And I want to speak today about issues that are important to both the Islamic and, generally speaking, the subcontinental world. My subject today is going to be the role of the intellectual and the role of critical consciousness. I'm very aware that I'm addressing a university audience, and I should tell you that I've now been teaching for almost 40 years. I've spent most of my life inside the wonderful walls of a university, whether as a student or later as a teacher. For me, the university, as I'm sure it is for all of you in whatever capacity you relate to it, the university provides an exceptional space, a kind of utopian space where freedom of thought, freedom of investigation, and freedom of expression are the very mission of the university in its role as teacher and instructor. We all know, of course, the extent to which the university is also the seat of learning and authority, al-ma'rifa wa-sulta in Arabic, or al-ilm in the case of science. One of the questions I think that all teachers and certainly students face is to understand the role of authority and learning, and not to be confused about that role. In my opinion, the search for knowledge, which is what the university provides teachers and students an opportunity for, is not imposed by authority, and it is not a matter of learning by heart or learning in a rote or automatic way what a figure of authority, the teacher or the professor, tells the student. In my opinion, the search for knowledge, both in the university and, I would hope, for the rest of one's life, the search for knowledge is a personal commitment to endless investigation, to ceaseless searching, to endless, also interminable doubt. This cannot be given once and for all by a teacher or by the reading of a book, no matter how important the book is. For me, as a teacher, I've always felt that the most important two things I can do are, in the first place, to communicate what knowledge I have to my students, but more important even than communicating knowledge is to communicate to students a sense of my doubt, my skepticism, and to raise a challenge to the students to continue their investigation, to continue their reading, to continue their questioning, so that even as they sit listening to me, exchanging ideas with me, they are also saying, what is it that we can discover that is wrong about what Saeed says? How can we go beyond what he says? And one of the things, therefore, that I think a teacher must do in the end is to stand back and tell the student, what I've given you is provisional, it's for you, but it's not enough. You must ask the question of what I can add to this knowledge, what I must do with this knowledge. As a student, I have to reappropriate the knowledge and not be content with simply receiving it from the teacher. The most important thing, therefore, is to get beyond the received idea to an idea that one, with the best of one's commitment and effort, creates oneself. I also think that in these difficult times, it's important to remember that the university, of course, is part of society. But it is not a solution for the special problems of a society. If in India, or in my part of the world, in the Middle East, or in the United States where I live and teach, there are innumerable social problems, problems of poverty, problems of race, problems of conflict, problems of economic injustice. The university, as a center of learning, cannot be the place where these problems are solved. We must never, certainly as teachers, we must never use the classroom or use the lecture hall as a place for resolving social problems. But on the other hand, the university is not an escape from society. Scores cannot be settled in the university, nor can we withdraw from the world if we are students or teachers. What we do in the university, therefore, is to study the potential and the possibility of citizenship in the full sense of the word, without the pressures of the need for a social solution. We must try to understand what are the issues, what is the history of injustice, what is the history of, what is the status of racial conflict, what is the status of ideas, humanistic ideas, scientific ideas, social ideas. Where do they come from? What do they represent? And what sort of attitude could one take towards them? But never must we assume that the university is a substitute for politics in the outside world. The university is a place where issues can be raised, where dialogue, where an exchange of ideas, with full respect for the views of others. That doesn't mean you accept the views of others. One can disagree violently, but at least the university offers the only place in society, I think, where the university is the only place in society where dialogue, exchange of ideas, tolerance, and skepticism are the essence of the human exchange. And this prepares, whether as teacher or as student, prepares us for citizenship in the full sense of the word. The responsibilities, the glories, the difficulties, and the hope for the future. I would like now to talk, having spoken a little bit about what I would call critical consciousness as what the university can give us in all fields, whether they're in the natural sciences or the human sciences, as a result of some of the things I've said, the endless search for knowledge, the endless questioning, the need to continue, never to rest, the eternal quest. These are the constituents of the intellectual, of the critical consciousness. But what about now the notion of the intellectual vocation? For me, the intellectual vocation is quite different from receiving a BA or a PhD or getting what we would call an education. The intellectual vocation is a separate thing. It happens to one later in life as one leaves the university and where one becomes a citizen in society. And it would seem to me that I have long believed that the role of the intellectual is to stir things up, to ask questions, to say things that others will not say, and to dare to venture beyond the given, the known, the conformity in which most of us live. The great American sociologist C. Wright Mills, who also taught at Columbia University, where I have been teaching since 1963, says the following: "The independent intellectual is among the few remaining personalities equipped to resist and to fight the stereotyping and consequent death of genuinely living things. Fresh perception now involves the capacity to continually unmask and to smash the stereotypes of vision and intellect with which modern communication, television, radio, newspapers, we're constantly assaulted by those every day. To smash the stereotypes of vision and intellect with which modern communications swamp us. Sometimes we feel we are drowning in a sea of news, sometimes contradictory, most of the time repetitious and insistent. These worlds," Mills continued, "these worlds of mass art and mass thought are increasingly geared to the demands of politics, and to the demands of interest. Newspapers, speeches in government, this is true all over the world. Television advertisement, television news, documentaries, all the systems of mass representation always reflect the interests of those who are producing these news. I think we have to be absolutely clear about that. There is no such thing as impartial views. All views represent a point of view. That is why, says Mills, it is in politics that intellectual solidarity and effort must be centered. Most important sentence. If the thinker does not relate himself or herself to the value of truth in political struggle, he cannot responsibly cope with the whole of live experience. One must be able to extract the truth from the conflicting, contradictory, ideological, overwhelming mass experiences of the contemporary media, and not only the media, but the world in which we live. The world in which we live is full of received ideas. People saying, well, that's the way we do things. This is the status quo. This is what you must conform to. And for me, the role of the intellectual is that which questions the status quo, that which challenges authority, that which always tries to go beneath the surface of the news, beneath the surface of the government report, beneath the surface of what is offered as authority and learning. So you see the process begins when one is a student, but it continues afterwards as one becomes a citizen in society. To do all of this, as a way of understanding the truth. Now, what are the problems specifically for the intellectual? In the first place, we have to decide whether everyone is an intellectual or whether very few people are intellectuals. Gramsci, the great Italian Marxist, who was the first 20th century thinker to write about intellectuals, said that every human being is an intellectual because he or she has an intellect, therefore you're an intellectual. But not everybody has the intellectual's function in society. And another important European thinker, a very right-wing thinker, Julien Benda, wrote a book in the late 1920s called The Betrayal of the Intellectuals, in which he said that intellectuals are really very few in number because the real intellectual is somebody like Socrates, somebody like Jesus, somebody who is a kind of an outsider who asks questions and challenges the status quo as nobody else had done before. So in a certain sense, the intellectual is a prophet, like an Old Testament prophet, somebody who asks questions that nobody is willing to ask, and fewer, of course, are willing to answer. For me, I think the intellectual is really not so much a person, but an attitude, a form of life, a form of questioning, a form of energy, which has, as I said earlier, more to do with speaking the truth and trying to understand what most people in their lives don't try to understand or accept as just given. Well, we'll go along and do it. So specifically then, what are the problems facing an intellectual in today's world? What is it that prevents the intellectual vocation from its full realization? In the first place, I think, and here I hope I will offend some of you, perhaps all of you, by saying that I think the greatest immediate obstacle to intellectual honesty and an intellectual vocation is the weight of tradition and of nation. Every system of education, every country, it's natural, teaches its students their language, the national language. It teaches students about their background, their race, their heritage, their traditions, their past and identity as citizens of that state. So Indians study about India, and at another level, they study about, in a case of a Jamia, Millia, Islamia, they study specifically the turath, the heritage, specific to Islam in the Indian context. In my own part of the world, we have a tremendous now debate going on about what is turath. Turath means tradition, the inherited tradition from your native culture, one's native culture. And then there's also the question of loyalty and patriotism to the nation. I remember the great English lexicographer, philosopher, and novelist and poet of the 18th century, Dr. Johnson, saying that patriotism is the last refuge of scoundrels. That when you don't know what to do and what to say, you say, my country, right or wrong, I'm with them. And if, again, you don't know what to say and you don't know where to go, you say, I will rely upon tradition. Tradition, in the end, is always correct. After all, it's the way we've been doing things. And I remember having many discussions with my late mother. I was a very difficult child, because I'd say, why don't we do this? And she would say, no, we do it this way. And I'd say, yes, but who said we do it this way? She said, everyone. And my immediate response was to say, well, I'm against them all. I want to do it what I consider to be the right way. But the pressures upon tradition, the pressures upon the individual of tradition and nation in times of difficulty become much stronger. There's a crisis. There's a sense of insecurity. There's an outside enemy. There's an inside enemy. In America, the McCarthy period. And there was a House Un-American Activities Committee deciding whether you were American or un-American, as to whether you subscribed to communism or were vaguely sympathetic to it, in which case you were a traitor. You could lose your job and you were finished. And of course, in times of national crisis and emergency, in times of war, there are very few people who ask the question, especially in the atmosphere of drum beating, and we must win, we must fight the enemy, who say, well, is a war in the interests of everyone? Is this a wise thing to do? Is widespread bloodshed and destruction a good idea? I remember during the Gulf War in 1991, I was an Arab living in America, but I was also an American. And while I opposed completely the policy of Saddam Hussein to invade and occupy Kuwait, I condemned it. I also condemned the national fever of what in America was called Operation Desert Storm, that we were going to go there and invade Kuwait and kick out Saddam Hussein because we were opposed to aggression. At which point, it was the role of the intellectual, even though it's very difficult to do that in an atmosphere where there's drum beating, even on the media, saying we have to go to war, we have to fight for what is right. You remind people, well, there are many other places in the world where land has been occupied for 30 years. In the case of Israel, occupying Palestinian, Syrian, Jordanian, Lebanese, and Egyptian land. Did the United States go to war against Israel for the occupation of land? No. Turkey occupied Cyprus in 1974. Did the United States go and fight a war against Turkey? No. Indonesia occupied East Timor in 1976 and killed thousands of people. Did the United States oppose that aggression? No. Therefore, the question is, why now? Because the interests of the United States are to safeguard oil, because it's a matter of national interest. It has nothing to do with the principle of non-aggression. It is something quite different. And the argument that you normally get is, well, you're not a patriot. We all have to rally round the flag. That is, in my opinion, the most dangerous threat. The sense of rallying around the flag, the sense of national emergency, the role of tradition and turath, background, affiliation, accepted unthinkingly. In my opinion, the role of the intellectual is to question all of these and see when they are appropriate and when they are not. The second challenge to the role of the intellectual is what I would call professionalism and expertise. Now, all of you students here, and faculty, I speak as one of you, all of us study particular subjects: chemistry, history, literature, biology, and so on. We are all certified by the university to practice in those fields. We are certified chemists, we're certified teachers of literature, and so on and so forth. We develop a sense of expertise correctly. We've spent a lot of time learning and studying, and that entitles us to privileges of rank, privileges you could put after your name, BA or PhD or whatever, and you get a job and so on and so forth. Now, my question is, at what point do you hide behind professionalism in order to avoid controversy? See, this is one of the great, during Vietnam in America, during the Vietnam War, I once heard a colleague of mine being asked by a student at the time when the United States was bombing hundreds of thousands of tons of bombs on North Vietnam, on Laos and Cambodia, asking a colleague of mine in the literature department, saying to this colleague, would you sign a petition saying that the bombing of innocent people by B-52s at a height of 60,000 feet, where the pilot feels nothing, but women and children and peasants, poor people, are getting destroyed, will you sign a petition saying that this is unjust? And to my shame, I heard, well, I mean, I attacked him later, but at the time, I heard my colleague say, no, I'm a professor of literature, I write about Shakespeare and Milton, I have nothing to do with bombing. I don't understand it. How many times have we heard that? That's not my field. I can't deal with it. What about when you say, what about the abuse of human rights in your own society? It's very clever to talk about the abuse of human rights in other societies, but what about the abuse of human rights in your society? The punishment of people for having unpopular opinions. And then you say, no, 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 look, I'm a chemist. I can't possibly, yeah. So you understand what I mean. The avoidance of controversy produces a kind of deadening conformity, which is the enemy of intellectual energy and intellectual honesty. The third great obstacle, and these are real. I mean, I'm not making, they don't sometimes happen, don't happen, they're there. For every intellectual, there is, for me, the most important, which is the relationship of the intellectual to power and authority. Now, I take a very strict view. I've been in politics as a defender of the cause of my people, the Palestinians, who have been silenced, dispossessed, and unacknowledged for years and years and years, suffering the most cruel torments. And their struggle means a great deal to me, not because I'm a Palestinian only, but because it is a just struggle, and it's a struggle for justice. But there is also the question of how far are you willing to go as you press a claim, as you try to be effective, all of us. There's no fun in writing wonderful articles that nobody reads, right? And having no effect. Every human being, particularly an intellectual or a scientist, would like to see his or her ideas translated into reality. Now, very often, you can't do that without, in the end, getting close to somebody in the society who has power, who helps you to get ahead, and who is close to the authority of the time. The question is, how many compromises are we willing to make in our pursuit of influence through power and authority? In my part of the world, in the Middle East, one of the reasons we have no democracy in the Arab world, it is a great shame, is that the position of most of our autocratic governments is that people who say critical things about the policies of that government, who talk about corruption, who dare to say something about the corruption of the ruling family, are very often tortured, put in jail, silenced. And rulers have a deep understanding of that. They know that the effect of such practices is to frighten other potential intellectual questioners, to frighten them away from ever saying anything. So we have, in the end, not only conformity, but self-censorship. I'm not going to say anything because I risk my job, I risk advancement, and I risk the possibility of jail. In the United States, which is a fantastically powerful, rich country, so many of the intellectual class, especially those who deal with social issues, whether in economics, politics, sociology, etc., even anthropology and related fields, feel that their most important goal in life is not to speak the truth honestly, to speak the truth to power honestly, but to try and get close to a political party. If there's a Republican administration, then you try to get into one of the Republican think tanks. If there's a Democratic administration, you try to get into one of them. And the whole question of whether it's just or unjust, or whether the issue is an issue of human decency or not, is never raised, because it might stop your moving forward. And therefore, you have people, colleagues of yours, you see them. I saw them during Vietnam, I see them during the Middle East crisis, who know that injustices are being committed. But no, they don't say anything about them because they want to be commissioned to write a paper for the Defense Department, or they want to be called to the State Department to consult. And if they have dangerous opinions, then they will never be called. So they say nothing. My position has always been never to aspire to a political office, because as an intellectual, political office is the death of your independence. You cannot be independent. I'm not saying that independence in and of itself, is a virtue, because sometimes you could be wrong. But if you're not independent, you can't even be wrong. You have to also be very much the creature of the press and the media. In America, for example, the media, which is supposed to be independent, I could spend hours telling you about our independent media. And of course, we make fun of censorship in the third world, as it's called, and so on and so forth. But it is a fact that when there is a particular government policy, I'll give you a simple example. 3 or 4 years ago, when President Clinton came to office, one of the great watchwords of his administration was, we're going to reform health care. Now, you should know that the United States is not only the wealthiest country in the world, but in many ways the most backward country in the world. We do not have universal health care. Over 50 million people in the United States do not have any form of health insurance. And the costs of medicine in the United States are astronomical. All right? So then there's a question of what should we do? And there's a national debate announced by the president himself. Now, one of the obvious alternatives, which was referred to at the time as the Canadian option, Canada being the country to our north, is that there is what is called a single-payer form of health insurance. In other words, the government insures everybody, which is the case in most countries of the world today. It's true in France, in Europe, it may be true here, I'm not sure. But it's true throughout the world that the government has a responsibility to its citizens, not in the United States. And the media was used, and used itself, to propagate this debate. But what was the debate about? Was it between those who wanted a single-payer Canadian-type national insurance policy and those who wanted private medicine as we now have? No. It was simply a debate within the context of the private medicine sphere. Because, why? The lobbies of the medical association, of the pharmaceutical companies who stand to make huge, astronomical sums of money by continuing this scheme, that is all they presented on television, and in the radio, and in the news, in newspapers. And those proponents of what in America is called socialized medicine, socialized said with a sneer as if it's something evil, you know, some communist sort of Russian Marxist-Leninist thing, to take care of poor people as they're dying, that's considered socialism, right? They're very bad. And the media never presented that point of view. So the media is also co-opted by authority and power. And let me cite as a last example a great journalist, I.F. Stone, who died 20 years ago, but who realized that I hope I offend somebody by saying this, that every government report is a lie. There are lies in it, because governments can't possibly tell the whole truth. There are corners, you know, there are things that are uncomfortable figures that are put under the carpet and so on. And so he established his own newspaper, because he said the newspapers are the height of prestige for a journalist in Washington is to have lunch with the Secretary of State. So he's not going to write the truth, because if he writes the truth, Secretary of State won't have lunch with him again. And he won't be a star, and he won't be put on television. So Stone started his own paper from his house. And he printed, it was only 4 pages. It was like this at the beginning, a small sheet of paper like this on 4 sides. And in it, he printed his doubts and his own private research into what the government was saying. And this was true during the Korean War, and then later, of course, during the Vietnam War, the government was lying, said, we're winning the war, all we need is another 200,000 troops and we'll win tomorrow, that kind of thing. There was Stone, individually, on his own, defying power and authority, refusing ever to have lunch with a minister or an employee of the State Department, because he wanted to preserve his independence. And I believe this very strongly, because I've been in politics, and I was frequently asked to join and come and do it, etc. I've always refused, because in the end you lose your independence and you lose the capacity to judge what is right from what is wrong, and you have to make compromises. 2 last points I want to make I think I've probably spoken too much, but I will just, these are very important subjects to me, so you'll forgive me. The fourth obstacle is what I call idolatry. We live in an age of insecurity. I mean, we're approaching the millennium. The Cold War is over. Nobody seems to know what values are stable and what values aren't. And it's therefore an age, in my opinion, of conversions. I think the intellectual must always be a secular person who has no idols. I mean, religion is a private thing. If you personally believe in God or in a God or gods, and in the sacred and the divine, that's your problem. I mean, you and your privilege. But I'm talking about social idols, so what Francis Bacon used to call the idols of the marketplace. It used to be the case, for example, that people would venerate, let's say, Marxism during the period of the Cold War. Then they realized that Marxism wasn't so good, so after the Cold War they converted, and they found capitalism, and they started worshipping that. And that sort of idolatry, there's a case of a French intellectual who's been circulating throughout the Arab world. He used to be the head of the former Communist Party in France. He then became a devout Catholic, and then recently he's become a Muslim. Why? Because by becoming close to Saudi Arabia, he can, you know, he's changed his name to an Islamic name, etc. He talks like them, etc. And that kind of idolatry sends shivers up and down my spine. It's the worst thing ever to do, because an intellectual must always guard against the worship of a false god, of idolatry, because then it's too easy to change them. Another one will come along and say, I'll tell you what, I'll give you a first-class ticket, and you come to Berlin. We'll give you you spend a year in Berlin, you have no obligations, you can read and study and all the rest of it, but in the end, you'll become one of us. Well, those kinds of rewards and idols are terrible, terrible gods to serve, and they always fail in the end. And that's why I say the intellectual must always remain not only detached, not only independent, as much as possible, nobody's totally independent, but also skeptical. You know, there's nothing that gives you your final, that requires from you your final approval, because there's always something new to be discovered. The world is always unfolding before us. One has to believe in history. So what, in the end, the final point I want to make, what is it then that the intellectual strives, given all these obstacles, tradition, professionalism, power, authority, idols, gods, what is it that the intellectual here in India, in the Arab countries, in Europe, in Africa, in Latin America, I think the project is the same. Just as the dangers are the same. You can either be a servant of power, a court intellectual, you sit at the foot of the sultan, and this is an Arabic expression, you know, you become a servant of the authority, or you're outside. And I much prefer the condition of outside. Somebody who is in permanent exile from power. But in pursuit of what? I think they have to be universal values. Universal values of justice, where you believe that all human beings, men, women, black, brown, red, yellow, whatever color, whatever provenance, are entitled to the same degree of freedom and equality, and that you don't say, well, yes, I believe that generally, but in this particular case, as John Stuart Mill said about India, but they're not ready for democracy, right? That's no good. If you believe in human rights, they have to be human rights everywhere. And you don't say, as we say in our part of the world, yes, but these are Western views. The Arab views, which allows us, supposedly Arab or Islamic views, which allows us to torture and whip and kill without trial. That's our privilege. That's complete nonsense. Islam says it. All human beings are entitled to dignity because they're the creatures of God. So one has to believe in universal values of justice and equality. And second, one must always try to speak the truth, even though the truth may be uncomfortable, and will embarrass people, like a small child at a party who'll say, "Daddy, why did you put your wig on backwards today?" You've got to have that sense of willing to risk embarrassment. And third, and most important, because this is what has guided me, you cannot do it from an isolated ivory tower. You have to be in the same world, the same ground as the oppressed and the silenced. This is why, for me, the whole Palestinian question was of such enormous symbolic significance. Not because I was Palestinian, of course I was Palestinian, but because the truth of our struggle, the truth of our suffering had been suppressed, had been silenced, and it was very, very difficult even to pronounce the word Palestine in the West. And so it is the job of the intellectual to recover memory, to say, let us not forget what our people suffered. Let us not forget what we went through. Let us not forget the mistakes of our leaders. We have to be also honest in confronting our leaders with their mistakes, because we're not worried about, well, if we say something too embarrassing, they won't give us a job. We can't become an important official or get an honorary degree. But it's important to say those things which power has silenced, no matter the cost. And that in itself is a source not only of pride, but also of human community. That is to say, in so doing, you affiliate yourself with people in a non-coercive, non-authoritarian manner, that you are with them in the struggle, and you pretend to nothing more than what they are and what they want. And your ability to speak is always subject to correction and to influence by those people who are struggling for what? For what we all struggle for. Independence, human dignity, toleration, and hope. The right to hope for a better time. This is not a utopian idea, just hope in general. Hope to transform what is a bad situation into a better one. And it seems to me without that, there is no point to being an intellectual. Thank you.
With the permission of the Shaykh al-Jamia, I declare the convocation closed.